Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with this panel, To the Unknown God, World Religions, and the Catholic Imagination. My name is Father Aquinas Beale. I'm a Dominican friar, but also a graduate student here at the University of Notre Dame in theology, concentrating on world religions, world church. No further ado about myself, but I'll now begin with our speakers. So our first speaker this afternoon is Prerita Govil, who is a Barry Scholar at the University of Oxford, pursuing graduate studies in comparative theology through the lens of Catholicism and Hinduism. In particular, Vaishnavism. So she previously graduated from American University in Washington with a BA in political theory. So please welcome Prerita.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction to my chair, to my fellow panelists, and to all of you for being here today. It's a great day to be at Notre Dame. So in the spirit of a conference on imagination, I would like to begin by telling a story. Imagine that the world is enveloped in a pervading darkness, as though you're in a dark cave with no light. Suddenly, a golden egg appears out of nowhere, out of what seems to be nothing more than thin air. And as your eyes curiously gaze over the shiny, lustrous, bright egg, carefully noting the curves and the zigzagged lines at the edges, it cracks open and something emerges. God. Indeed, Prajapati, which is known as the creator in mainstream Hinduism, emerges out of this egg. Prajapati is then the being who creates all the other deities and through whom human beings are made. Now, I know what you're thinking. Where did this egg come from? Is God the chicken or the egg? Or both? And what does it mean ultimately for God, the starting and the ending point of all creation, to be himself created from something, to be hatched from an egg? And how does having such a story as a basis for creation impact the way one understands and interacts with the world? So in this presentation, I will begin with the Hindu creation myth as put forth in the Rgveda, the first of which I just illustrated for you. I will inquire particularly into the identity of the creator for Hindus, whose ambiguity both complicates but also sheds light on the nature of created existence of God. And I will then turn to Genesis and the fall, asking how we may understand it to be in dialogue with the Rgveda. And such an inquiry is important in helping us understand the differences between uncreated existence and the created existence of God, exploring what this might mean for our own self-knowledge. So before I begin, just a few caveats. Though I've chosen to focus on the Rgveda since it contains the first recorded story of creation in ancient India and one which is widely accepted as the story of creation by Orthodox Hindus, it is to be noted that there are other later hymns surrounding creation. And for some background, the Rgveda forms one of the core sacred canonical Hindu texts known as the Vedas and is the oldest known Vedic text. Though it's been passed down orally since about the 2nd millennium BCE, scholars believe that the text was composed in its written form between 1500 and 1000 BCE. And the two hymns that I've chosen to draw from are one, the Hiranyabirga Prajapatya, also known as the Kaha or the Who hymn, and the Prajapati Parameshtan, the creation hymn. Forgive my Sanskrit. For the purposes of this presentation, I will only look at the substance of these verses as composed in prose, particularly the translation by Jameson and Brethren rather than the verse. So let's see if I can do this. Okay, so turning to the Rgvedic hymn, you now know the story of the golden egg, but because it's probably a hymn that's unfamiliar to most, I thought it would be worthwhile to read. So it begins, "The golden embryo evolved in the beginning. Born the Lord of what came to be, he alone existed. He supports the earth and the heaven here. Who is the God to whom we should do homage with our oblation? Who is the giver of breath, the giver of strength, whose command all honor, whose command the gods honor? Whose shadow is immortality, whose shadow is death? Who is the God to whom we should do homage with our oblation?" Who became king of the breathing, blinking, moving world, just alone by his greatness? Who is Lord of the two-footed and four-footed creatures here? Who is the God to whom we should do homage with our oblation? Whose are these snow-covered mountains, the Himalayas, in their greatness? Whose is the sea together with the world stream? They say, whose are these directions? Whose two arms, the zenith and nadir? Who is the God to whom we should do homage with our oblation? By whom the mighty heaven and earth were made firm, by whom the sun was studied, by whom the firmament, who was the one measuring out the airy realm in the mid-space? Who is the God to whom we should do homage with our oblation? Towards whom the two battle lines, heaven and earth, looked, studied with his help, though trembling in mind, those upon which the risen sun radiates. Who is the God to whom we should do homage with our oblation? When the lofty waters came, receiving everything as an embryo and giving birth to the fire, then the life of the gods evolved alone. Who is the God to whom we should do homage with our oblation? Who by his greatness surveyed the waters, receiving ritual skill as an embryo and giving birth to the sacrifice? Who the God over gods alone existed? Who is the God to whom we should do homage with our oblation? Let him not do us harm, he who is the progenitor of earth, or who with foundations that are real engendered heaven, and who engendered the gleaming, softy waters. Who is the God to whom we should do homage with our oblation? O Prajpati, no one other than you has encompassed all these things that have been born. Let what we desire as we make oblation to you be ours. We would be lords of riches. And here's the text in its entirety. So let us first begin by inquiring into the nature of the creator, the Hiranyagarbha, which is translated variously in Sanskrit as the golden egg, the golden embryo, or the universal womb, just names of this nameless deity. So some scholars, most notably Jameson and Brereton, interpret the golden embryo as being the sun, insofar as it might have been born as the center of the cosmos, and is what gives life to the gods. Though the golden egg may be thought to be the sun in line with its role as creator, a closer look at the text, particularly verse 5, by whom the sun is studied, makes such an interpretation unlikely. What I would like to turn our attention to is the hymn's refrain, which you may have noticed is the last line of each verse that's being repeated. Who is the God to whom we should do homage with our oblation? So recent commentators, especially Wendy Doniger, ask if this refrain is to be understood as a question or an assertive statement. Is the question, who is the God to whom we should do homage with our oblation? Or is who the name of the God that we should do homage with our oblation, or the word kaha in Sanskrit? And this raises several questions. If the refrain is a question, what does such uncertainty entail? Does one simply accept it to be a mystery, to not know where all things come from? But if the refrain is a statement, what would it mean for who to be the starting point of all creation? Who as indicative of being? We see here that the last verse finally attaches a name to the unnamed deity, but this verse is a later addition, reflecting a redactional effort to not leave the mystery of this principle unresolved. And in that verse, the deity is revealed to be Prajpati, the Lord of creatures, who is the creator God. And though I didn't read this hymn in verse for this presentation, this is where it becomes useful to do so, because the phrase "he alone existed" in the first verse and verse 8 create a ring structure which defines the boundaries of the main body of the hymn, which show that the last two verses 9 and 10 are likely later additions. But the question who beckons us towards a query of identity, of purpose, and now we'll consider who this egg might have come from, whose embryo. So verse 7 gives us a hint as to where the golden egg came from. When the lofty waters came, receiving everything as an embryo and giving birth to the fire, then the life of the gods evolved alone. What are these waters? Such a verse seems to imply that the golden egg was born from the waters. But if God was created by the forces of nature and is therefore subservient to nature in some way, doesn't this challenge his status as a creator? To further complicate matters, we're going to turn to the second hymn in the Rigveda, the Prajapati Parameshtan, and keeping in mind this question of where the egg came from. So to read a few verses, the non-existent did not exist, nor did the existent exist at that time. There existed neither the airy space nor heaven beyond. What moved back and forth, from where and in whose protection did water exist a deep depth? Death did not exist, nor deathlessness then. There existed no sign of night nor of day. That one breathed without wind by its independent will. There existed nothing else beyond that. Darkness existed, hidden by darkness in the beginning. All this was a signless ocean. What existed as a thing coming into being, concealed by emptiness, that one was born by the power of heat. Then, in the beginning, from thought there evolved desire, which existed as a primal semen. Searching in their hearts through inspired thought, poets found the connection of the existent in the non-existent. The cord was stretched across. Does something exist below it? Does something exist above? There existed placers of semen, and there existed greatnesses. There was independent will below, offering above. Who really knows? Who shall here proclaim it? From where was it born? From where this creation? The gods are on the side of the creation of this world. So then, who does know from where it came to be? This creation, from where it came to be, if it was produced or if not, he who is the overseer of this world in the furthest heaven, he surely knows. Or, if he does not know. So, in verse 4, here's the text in its entirety. We read, then in the beginning from thought there evolved desire, which existed as a primal semen. And verse 5, their cord was stretched across, that something exists below it, and so forth. And the words semen and cord, perhaps like an umbilical cord, invoke an image of birth, and we get a fuller picture of creation here than we did in the first hymn. But what do we make of thought evolving, from thought evolved desire? Desire becomes the primal semen, the origin of beings. And how do we make sense of this with the question, who, as the beginning of all creation from the first hymn? And to further complicate matters, the last verse surmises that this creation from where it came to be, if it was produced or if not, he who is the overseer of this world in the furthest heaven, he surely knows, or if he does not know. And just this whole hymn is just shrouded in so much mystery. Like there wasn't a non-existent, there was an existent, there wasn't death, there wasn't deathlessness. And by ending with a question, the hymn seems to leave one unsatisfied. But it does draw our attention back to thought, suggesting that it's somehow eternal and fed by desire. So keeping all this mystery in mind, we turn to Genesis, which maybe I don't need to read for most people in the room, but I did think that it would be good to have the text just in case. So the very opening lines of Genesis are, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and from which then comes the creation of light, day and night, the sky, land, seas, vegetation, and so forth. There is no question as to where God came from. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God is from whom all proceed, and we're satisfied with what Aquinas calls the uncreated existence of God. And from the pure infinite goodness of God, we get man. And holding on to the poignant phrase of the Rgvedic creation hymn, then in the beginning from thought evolved desire, we're reminded of the story of the fall. God tells Adam and Eve to not eat of the forbidden tree of knowledge of good and evil, but both through the snares of the serpent and their own ignorance, they disobey and eat the fruit, sinning and becoming falling. Perhaps we can think of desire as what causes Adam and Eve to commit a mortal sin, but it's also what allows the creation of humanity as we know it. In this way, the Rgvedic hymn helps us better understand our own conception of creation. This is not to downplay the differences, however. While it is clear that what constitutes thought and what constitutes desire in the fall, the Rgvedic hymn still leaves the attributes of each as ambiguous, and it's not clear if God is both thought and desire in the Rgvedic context. And what do we make of this? Well, one might say that the Hindu creation hymns are simply a case of God creating himself, that he is not in fact subservient to the waters or forces of nature, but that he is created from his own essence. Whether or not this is plausible, it is interesting to consider why one would provide such an account of creation. The short answer is, I don't know, but we can think about it a bit more, thinking of the line in the second hymn about the poets and their desire and trying to help us understand creation and what might be going on there. And I just think that engaging with a text like the Rigveda and these hymns helps us stretch the limits of what our understanding of the world is, and we may or may not agree with it, but it helps us find God in all things. And it is natural to question into our origins and where we come from, and Genesis provides a simple account which helps us understand our limits as human beings who like to rationalize and ask why until it's no longer possible. So having a clear account of the uncreated existence of God and how desire led man to sin allows us to have these first principles and gives order to an otherwise often unordered life. But engaging with the creation stories like the Hiranyagarbha and the Prajapati Parameshdan both give us a deeper appreciation for what is familiar to us, while the fragments of truth contained in the text deepen our understanding and help us articulate questions that we might not otherwise. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jonathan Bieler, who will be speaking on Maximus the Confessor's Mystagogy, the liturgy as sacramental imagination. Dr. Beale received his doctorate in theology from the University of Zurich in 2017 with a dissertation on the coherence of Maximus the Confessor's thought. He also works on the scholastic period and published articles on Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Maximus the Confessor, and Origen. In his work, he strives to combine the usage of historical critical methods with faithfulness to the Church's living tradition. He is currently engaged in research concerning the sacramentality in the Church Fathers, especially Origen and Maximus. So, without further ado.
Thank you, Father Aquinas. Yeah, I apologize, I have no fancy PowerPoint, so you just have to take my word for it. I represent the Christian angle in this panel on world religion in an unabashed way, you could say. According to Thomas Aquinas, imagination is the one active power that treasures and recalls images of sensible objects once encountered, even in their absence. In other words, it is the human faculty that disposes faithfully and creatively over images and offers them to the intellect, which abstracts from them and recognizes through them the invisible qualities of beings. Imagination, as a power closely connected to memory, therefore serves to facilitate the epistemic passage from the sensible appearance to the intellectual essence of a being by holding the images present to the intellect. In light of this definition, I will first give a rough sketch of the debate around the status of images in the early Church, as it appears in Origen and Evagrius of Pontus. Then I will argue that Dionysius the Areopagite and Maximus the Confessor in his wake suppose that something analogical to the activity of imagination happens in the sacramental and liturgical theurgy, or divine work of the Church. Both fathers describe the Church's activity as a clothing of invisible realities with sensible veils. When torn in two by the mystery of Christ's death on the cross, these veils or images show forth the divine, like the temple's curtain, when torn open, grants access to the Holy of Holies. So first, Evagrius and Origen, or Origen and Evagrius. Imagination and the images traded therein were always a double-edged sword for the fathers of the Church, as well as later on in Church history, as everybody knows, I'm assuming. In the 3rd century, Origen of Alexandria's work on first principles warns of the dangers of applying anthropomorphic images to God directly, without reflecting on the spiritual and invisible truth they convey to us about God, who is, he says, incorporeal spirit, simple and transcendent. To speak of the eyes, the hands, the arms, and the feet of God, for example, as Scripture does, must not mean that God has a body. Rather, one must understand these sayings spiritually and according to the dignity of God. In other words, images should serve the passage to the transcendent, but they can also be an obstacle thereto. Based on Origen's notion of divine incorporeality, and on the Cappadocian understanding of the transcendence of God over rational definitions against the Arian eunomios, I may be presupposing too much here, just forget if you don't understand it. Based on Origen's anthropomorphic images of God, for Evagrius, these anthropomorphic images of God in Scripture became an occasion for suspicion in the early monastic movement, associated with the Cappadocians, but especially with Evagrius of Pontus during the 4th century. Anthropomorphic images carried the false sense of God's bodiliness and comprehensibility with them and needed to be overcome if Christians were to uphold the Trinitarian confession of faith in an incorporeal and transcendent God who was not subject to numbers, qualities, extension, definition, and names. Elizabeth Clark points out in her book, The Origenist Controversies, she points out that, quote, this radically anti-imagistic confession of Evagrius had consequences for worship, especially for an understanding of the Eucharist and prayer, end quote. The very visibility of the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, could lead the mind astray from worshipping in spirit and truth. Evagrius thus exhorts the monks to pure prayer and contemplation which rid the ascetic's mind of images and conceptions altogether. Images in the imagination would distract the ascetic from contemplation of the invisible and incorporeal God. Clark summarizes, quote, to achieve apatheia, the monk must free his mind of images, which tend to arouse emotions. The mind should become so imageless, that it does not entertain even concepts, end quote. Imagination and conceptual thought is here simply an obstacle on the path to God, so it seems. The light in which God dwells for Evagrius is formless, and thus the mind of the monk also has to become totally pure and naked of any forms. The mind, the nous, is like a lamp that was created to absorb the formless light of God. Clark calls this, quote, an internalized form of iconoclasm, end quote, and Evagrius, quote, the quintessential iconoclast, end quote. Sensible images, and by implication the sensible sacraments, liturgy and church hierarchy, need to be negated for the sake of the ascension of the mind to God. So it seems for Evagrius. Now moving on to Dionysius and Maximus, as if that wasn't enough, right, in 9 minutes. Alexander Golitsyn supposes an iconoclastic and anti-ecclesial monastic context for the 5th or 6th century, according to author Dionysius the Areopagite, which fits well with what Clark has described for Evagrius. Dionysius had a problem. He was confronted by a tradition of ancient provenance which, in its extreme form, threatened the church of the sacraments and of the bishops. Here, I think, he says, is one very good reason, perhaps even the reason, for Dionysius' adoption of a sub-apostolic pseudonym, end quote. In other words, Dionysius wanted to uphold the positive value of images, of the church's sacraments, the liturgy, and the hierarchy, and at the same time connect these image-like realities by which God becomes present to the inner reality of the heart of man and to the contemplative activity of the mind. Neoplatonism played a key role in his project. Quote, Golitsyn, in late Neoplatonism, Dionysius doubtless saw the potential for a reasoned balance and harmony between the subjective experience of ascetic seers, whose capacity for vision he affirmed, and the objective, visible liturgy of the church, through which God's presence in Christ is mediated to us, end quote. For Dionysius, as well as Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century, the Church mediates God and invisible realities reliably and faithfully to the soul through church architecture, to the soul, to the whole human being, through church architecture, the liturgy, the sacraments, scripture, and the hierarchy. Dionysius writes in his Divine Names, quote, "We now grasp these things in the best way we can, and as they come to us, wrapped in the sacred veils of that love toward humanity, with which scripture and hierarchical traditions cover the truths of the mind, with things derived from the realm of the senses." End quote. Covering invisible realities with sensible veils, the invisible with images, is the proper activity of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, as well as the divine love toward humanity. At the center of this mediation by way of the senses stands Jesus Christ, however, and him in the Eucharist. Dionysius says in Golitzin's translation, quote, "It would not be possible for the human intellect, nous, to be ordered with that immaterial imitation of the heavenly minds, i.e. the angels, unless it were to use the material guide that is proper to it, reckoning the visible beauties as reflections of the invisible splendor, the perceptible fragrances as impressions of the intelligible distributions, the material lights an icon of the immaterial gift of light, the sacred and extensive teaching of the scriptures, an image of the intellect's intelligible fulfillment, the exterior ranks of the clergy, an image of the harmonious and ordered state of the intellect, which is set in order for divine things, and our partaking of the most divine Eucharist is an icon of our participation in Jesus Christ." End quote. This is one sentence. So. Arguably, this imaging activity of the Church resembles the poetic activity of imagination in the human being. Such imagination of the Church, however, is sacramental because it is embedded in and represents the incarnation of the Logos, who in himself is one, simple and hidden, but becomes composite and sensible through his goodness and love for humanity. During the liturgy, the hierarch, i.e. the bishop, contemplates the events of salvation history narrated in Scripture with spiritual eyes and proceeds to imitate Christ as he, quote, "performs the most divine things and presents the praised things to the eye by way of the symbols presented in a holy fashion." End quote. In the sacraments, most evidently, the Church is to present invisible things in images and visible veils. Quote, "The bishop describes in these veiled gifts in a visible way to the eye Jesus Christ, our intelligible life in images, Christ who became form from our form out of divine hiddenness, through incarnation, through love for humanity." End quote. The incarnation and Christ's humanity then appear as the image of the divine love par excellence. The image receives here a Christological and ecclesiological foundation, and so does imagination. The ecclesiastical hierarchy itself is an image of the celestial hierarchy of the ranks of angels. Visible creation as such holds forth the invisible things of God for Dionysius as well as for Paul. Moving on to Maximus the Confessor, who is walking in the footsteps of Dionysius and develops this Christological foundation of the imaging activity of the Church further in his commentary on the liturgy and other passages in his work. The activity of the Church is to unite the cosmos. The justification of this activity, he says, quote, "That blessed elder said that according to a first application of contemplation, the Holy Church carries a type and image of God, as it possessed the same activity like him in imitation and type." End quote. Another quote from the same passage. "Like God made everything through infinite power and brought it into being, and binds providentially together with each other and with themselves the intelligible things and the sensible things, according to the same manner also the Holy Church is shown to enact in relation to us the same things as God, like an image to its archetype." End quote. In other words, beside many other activities, the Church imitates the loving and kenotic divine activity of bringing forth visible images of invisible realities, The visible church made with hands lets us see an image, the invisible church not made with hands. By uniting the images and realities with each other and making God present in the sacraments, the church and her hierarchs perform what could be called a sacramental imagination. And I'm aware this is a very wide term, but thinking about the term sacramental imagination in the context of Maximus and the Fathers, this seems to be the most apt way or place to locate it. Maximus contemplates the liturgy as a visible manifestation and enactment of invisible realities that brings the participants into communion with God and with each other. The Church shows that, quote, the whole intelligible cosmos appears mystically portrayed in the whole sensible cosmos by way of symbolic forms to those who are able to see. And the whole sensible cosmos appears in the whole intelligible cosmos, made gnostically simple through the logoi, through the mind. The intelligible is in the sensible through the logoi, and the sensible in the intellectual through the types. And if the things that do not appear are seen in what does appear, as is written in Romans 1:20, how much more are those that appear understood through what does not appear, to those who devote themselves to spiritual contemplation? Symbolical contemplation of intelligible things is by way of visible things. Spiritual science and intellection of visible things is by way of invisible things. It is necessary that they are mutually indicative of each other and that they reflect each other completely truly and that they clearly and soundly relate to each other, end quote. That was a long quote. But it just showed the mutual perichoretic relationship between the invisible and the visible realities, and it's in a way the task of the Church to bring the two into this relationship. The mutual relationship and interdependence of image and what is imaged is clearly stated here. In the context of the liturgy, images are not primarily obstacles for the passage to the invisible, but their mutual perichoretic illumination and reflection makes the one cosmos totally present and accessible in the other. As was the case for Dionysius, one could also read this as a critique of monastic iconoclasm. As for Maximus, sensible and invisible in the liturgy and body and soul in the human beings are related to each other in a reciprocal fashion. However, Maximus does integrate the Evagrian critique of images by way of giving the concept of the image a pneumatological and Christological foundation. After the fall of Adam, the evil one, i.e. the devil, has, quote, in the beginning through sin nailed the inquiring and searching powers of man to the nature of visible things, such that all who participate in this nature have their intellectual and rational powers circumscribed by the appearance of sensible things, and possess no conception of the things beyond the senses. Fittingly, therefore, the grace of the All-Holy Spirit restored the affixed power by detaching it from the material things for those who, by no intent of their own, have become fixed to them under the deception, end quote. The passage from images to what is imaged is performed by the grace of the Holy Spirit, which is prevalently given in baptism. The Holy Spirit, through the sacraments and the liturgy, configures the Christian to Christ. The language of being nailed to the sensible already indicates that the passage from image to invisible spiritual reality is based upon the paschal mystery of Christ. This Passover from the visible to the invisible involves a kind of necessary death before the Spirit detaches the Christian from the cross of the sensible. Such a Passover is equally necessary in exegesis, where one has to pass from letter to spirit without thereby denigrating or rejecting the letter as such. The problem is the remaining nailed to the letter and the sensible, not the sensible and the letter as such are problems. Arguably, Maximus says as much in a famous and mysterious passage of his Centuries on Theology and Economy, where he says, quote, all sensible things are in need of the cross. The cross, in this instance, is the disposition that keeps in check the relation of the acts in sense perception with regards to them. When the natural activity and motion around all things is taken away together with the relation to them, Then the Logos, alone existing in himself, shines forth as resurrected from the dead. He possesses all that is from him, circumscribed in him. End quote. One could read this as saying that through the sensible man is lifted up to the intelligible, but through the sensible only as a cross, and that the spiritual is planted in the sensible, but only as in a tomb, from which it needs to be resurrected by way of the cross, the paschal mystery. Maximus says, quote, intelligible things need the tomb, which is the total immobility of the acts performed in the mind in regards to them, end quote. For Maximus to conclude, the church is a kind of candelabra, illuminating the sensible cosmos like the golden lampstand in Zechariah 4. By the power of the Spirit, the church can read the letter of Scripture spiritually and by way of imitation actively consecrate sensible bread and wine with the presence of Christ. Sacramental images have to undergo a kind of death, like the letter undergoes a kind of death in being understood and read spiritually. The same is true for all actions involving the sensible and the body, if they are to be truly in the image and likeness of God incarnate, the one, quote, who cannot put to death in the spirit the actions of the body, so that he lives the blessed life in the spirit, dies the death of sin every day, end quote. As I hope to have shown, Maximus integrates Evagrius' concerns about the image and imagination by developing a sacramental and paschal conception of the image. Sacramental imagination seems a fitting term to express the activity of the church as it enters into communion with God and with the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beale. Our next speaker is Gabriel Said Reynolds, who will be giving a talk entitled, Is God Safe? A Conversation with Islam. Professor Reynolds is the Crowley Professor of Islamic Studies and Theology at the University of Notre Dame. He's the author of The Quran and the Bible, Text and Commentary, as well as Allah, God and the Quran, and Christianity and the Quran. In addition to his writing, he also hosts a YouTube channel, which is, I guess, entitled, or called Exploring the Quran and the Bible. So, welcome, Professor Reynolds.
Thank you. 15 minutes?
15 to 20, yeah. Sort of
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to keep it to 15. Hello, everyone. Really glad to be here. I'm really grateful to the Nicola Center for bringing us all together every year. It's a beautiful service to the church and to the public generally. It's okay. You can stay. Grateful to my fellow panelists for those two beautiful presentations, and to Father Aquinas for chairing this panel. This is a really simple talk, which is basically an argument that an encounter with a non-Christian religion can play the role basically of teaching us a lesson. And here the lesson is more or less that through Islam we can learn how to take religion seriously, including the ethical dimensions of religion. So you can read that bit from Lion, Witch, in the Wardrobe on the right-hand side of the screen as I go through the basic elements of this really brief talk. So first, I'd like to say a word sort of anecdotally. I haven't done sociological research on this, about what I perceive principally through my students here at the University of Notre Dame as Gen Z attitudes to Christianity. So I'll try to be generous to, I have 5 kids, so I've got Gen Z in my family, so I'll try to be generous to Gen Z, but just a thought or two about that. And then the second step will be basically engagement with Islam and the Islamic idea of Sharia. And then finally, something about the Catholic imagination, engaging with Thomas Aquinas as a third step. And hopefully there'll be some coherence in these 3 steps. So first, Jesus is my buddy, or maybe not. So, okay, so this is random Gen Z person, a quotation from an article in the National Catholic Reporter. You can read through that. And I've noted that there is a sort of tension between the sort of disposition you see represented in that quotation, and then the experience of many young people, young Americans, Catholics and others, who go to Muslim majority countries, say Egypt or Morocco or wherever, and they find something really beautiful there in a culture which doesn't always incarnate the sort of disposition in the quotation. So places where religion is really central, ethical norms, including those norms which are not immediately apparent to sort of common sense, but are followed because the religion demands it of you. Why pray 5 times a day, not 4 or 6? Why eat this and not that? Why is the rule this or that about personal hygiene? All of these things that, the call to prayer and the Friday sermon is broadcast with loudspeakers into the street. A lot of young Americans go to Morocco or wherever, and they find, this is cool, like this is beautiful, they love their religion. Whereas in the American context, they often express something like you find in the quotation. It's not always just like total relativism, like all religions are path to God, that kind of thing. Sometimes it's a sort of way of being Christian, even if one is, more exclusivist. That is, maybe summarized by the statement, Jesus is my buddy. So this kind of like friendship with Jesus as a central principle. It's not really about obedience or submission, certainly not fear of God in the Christian life. And then there's pushback against that. So I'm not the first one to push back against that. So there's an article from some Catholic website contradicting this. Okay, so what can we learn from Islam about all of this? I'd like to introduce, basically in a very general way, the idea of Sharia, which you've probably heard of. So I just, kind of generally present it maybe in a new way, at least in the American scene. I'll get back to that Arabic word in the parentheses there, lahu. But first, just in regard to Sharia generally, it's sometimes rendered as Islamic law, something like that, which is fine. But it does have this capacious sense of basically kind of the global body of God's demands upon humans. So that can go from personal hygiene, what you shave and when you shave, and everything else, without going into too much detail about that. It could be the way you pray, but it also involves even creedal or theological questions. God sort of places this demand or imposes this demand that you be attentive to what he wants from you. And there's lots of internal debate among Muslims about, is it this or that? Is such a thing required or just recommended? Or is it discouraged or completely forbidden? And then also in the theological realm, there's lots of debate. But the general principle that God does place demands upon you, that he does have a will for the individual, maybe for society as well. That whole thing is Sharia. And that means that the task of the human, well, there's really 2 tasks for us. First, is to understand what that is, because there's actually no book of Sharia. I ref high school soccer games, and we have a book for Indiana high school soccer. Everything's in there basically. If someone complains about something, it's rule something, point something. So we don't have that for God as cosmic ref. There's no book, so that's the first challenge for Muslims, and this is called fiqh in Arabic, which means jurisprudence, basically. So what is Sharia? What does God actually want from us? And then the second bit, of course, is doing what God wants from us. And so, that's tough. Actually, the first part is tough, the knowing, and then the second part, the doing, is also tough. The first part involves usually the role of specialized scholars who have studied Quran and other things, other sorts of Islamic traditions. But the bit about doing it is also tough because there are obstacles according to Islam. First, the human person, even if Islam doesn't teach something like original sin, nevertheless, humans naturally sort of incline towards evil. The Quran actually has lots of statements about the human tendency to forget, to be hasty, to be ungrateful, to be unbelieving. So that's kind of natural. In fact, this is expressed sometimes with this Arabic word nafs, in parentheses there, which means the element of the human person, sort of clumsily translated carnal soul. I don't even know what that could possibly mean. But the element of the human person that kind of commands you to do evil. So that's a problem. And then, of course, there's another problem, which is a Satan who really wants us to get off of the straight path. This image of straight path is very important in the Quran and in Islamic thought. So Satan sort of ambushes us, tries to. So it's very difficult to do, which means you have to take this seriously, right? So this is not something to mess around with. Life is not a plaything. So that's the word lahu, the Quranic word for this idea of just, seeing life as a diversion or something. Therefore, there are great stakes. So it's not only that to take this seriously because there are challenges and opponents, but also because the stakes are high. And so you have all these Quranic verses on the right-hand side which speak about the reward. Paradise as a reward is sort of held out before you for those who can run the race successfully, and those who don't, who stray from the straight path, will be punished in hellfire. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead really quickly and just give an example from a relatively contemporary Muslim thinker who sort of, I guess, manifests or represents the seriousness of the religious life. And this is an Indian, later Pakistani, Abul Ala Maududi, very influential in the politics in Pakistan, still influential today, long after his death. But, in this short book that he wrote originally in Urdu, later was translated to English, he basically says, listen, the whole world is divided into two groups. The believers who basically think clearly and understand that man owes an obligation to God, that God has demands upon us, and they seek to fulfill those demands. He argues that humans actually kind of naturally understand this. So to be an unbeliever is a sort of deformity of our natural condition, which is interesting. Actually, there's ways to complicate that or contradict that. And then, the other sort of person are the unbelievers who have deformed or misshapen their natural inclination to know, worship, and show gratitude to God. And then, he argues that the punishment for disbelief is not only hellfire, but things will sort of fall apart here and now for unbelievers. It's not all in this passage here, but in what follows, he'll basically say that unbelievers are on a path to ruin in their family life, in their role in society, and they will not experience flourishing or well-being. And I mean, the key point for him is that humans have this natural sense that they should be grateful to God, they should obey God, but those who sort of turn aside from that, it's basically because of this struggle within the human about whether one takes seriously what God demands of us. And so there's Edmund there in the castle of the Queen of Narnia or the White Witch, depending on which team you're on, who presumably he goes into this castle, this spooky castle, matches with Halloween, and, his natural reason should say to him, this is probably not the right place to go, all of this, but he's had Turkish delight, and you know what happens after that. Okay, on to basically the last section. So I'd just like to shift back towards Catholic, or really Christian thinking generally. Actually, in this section, there's nothing too much, at least in the following slide, too much that's specifically Catholic. And to think of this notion of taking life seriously, how can Christians learn from Islam? And as a sort of thought experiment, I thought I'd discuss a text that I often teach to our undergraduates here at Notre Dame, which is a short text of Aquinas, not that one, on the reasons for the faith, written just after he completed the Summa Contra Gentiles. There's a neat backstory to the text because it was provoked by a letter that he received from another Dominican priest who was in the city of Antioch in the east, who said, listen, I've spoken to a Muslim, and he's presented these challenges to the Christian faith. You can kind of read through them here, about the Trinity and the Incarnation, about salvation through the cross, about the Eucharist, and about free will. So principally those 5 challenges. I'll just talk for another 10 seconds or so to see maybe if you want to get through all of those things, because I won't read them. And Thomas eventually wrote this treatise in response. We don't know if it got to the guy in Antioch and if it had any effect. Usually these conversations don't go well. But what I really want to speak about is a section on the De Rationibus Fidei, which deals with the Incarnation in this context. Thomas is straightforward because, you saw one of the Muslim questions, sorry, just to go back, is in the second paragraph there, why should the Son of God be crucified for the salvation of the human race? If God could save the human race without the Son's suffering, or simply make man so he could not sin. And Thomas, as many will know, doesn't say this is the only way that God could save humanity. He says that it is a fitting way, and then he devotes a couple of pages about why it is fitting, and I'll focus here on the Incarnation. He goes on to the sacrifice in the Paschal Mystery on the cross. But just in terms of the Incarnation, he says, God has taken this step because his principal concern was with the rational will of humans, which distinguishes us from animals, especially my dog. And so God is interested in addressing that element of the human person, which is misshapen by sin, and to invite us back with our own rational and free will to the love of God. So how does God seek to provoke our rational will towards the love of God? It is by showing us that he loves us. So you can read that nice statement in blue there. But then he says, more than that, he says, God was thoughtful because he realized that most humans have trouble sort of focusing on spiritual things. There may be a couple of them. We heard of some of them in the previous presentation, Dionysius or others who could handle that. But most humans have difficulty thinking of these spiritual things. And so if you read through the blue, there's a really beautiful passage where he says, God gave us a way, basically, to know him as a person so that we could understand his nature. Again, to provoke our love towards him. And the last phrase is beautiful, so that even children can know and love God as someone like themselves. And then this is kind of the real point in the connection with Islam. I'll be done in just a minute here. So what does this mean, in fact, for our life here and now, for carrying out our religious life? Well, in his own way, which is different than what Maududi argues about Sharia, in his own way, Thomas basically says, listen, this means you need to take your life as a Christian seriously, right? Our goal, what God wants from us, is a spiritual communion and happiness which exceeds what even the angels can imagine. If that's our destiny and our goal, we can't waste our life on lahu, remember that Arabic word meaning diversion. Okay, hopefully that's clear enough. Just a last page there with just a couple of final thoughts. Generally when we think of encounter with non-Christian religions, usually 2 options are before us. One is relativism, kind of like that opening quotation. Basically, it's all good. This is very common in our Notre Dame students. Sociologist here at Notre Dame, Christian Smith, has written a whole bunch of books on this as a Gen Z, kind of a marker of Gen Z attitudes to religion. Or the other option is basically to fight, so either defensively or aggressively in apologetics or polemics. But there's a third way, which is to learn from another religion. So what can Islam teach us? There's a quotation from Paul, but I think Muslims teach us to be watchful, to stand firm in our faith, to be courageous, to be strong, and then secondly, to take life seriously. So I'm just bringing back the quotation from Thomas Aquinas about our dignity, and one more quotation from Paul there from 1 Corinthians. So that's it. Thank you. Should I just close it?
I think someone, yeah. So, all right. Thank you to all of our speakers. They made the first half of my job relatively pretty easy by keeping really well to time. So we have a bit over 15 minutes for Q&A, and I think someone will come around with a microphone.
Thank you all. I actually had a question on the first presentation on Prerita. It struck me when you were going through the first creation myth there, your focus on the continual refrain through the first part of it. And when you drew the comparison to Genesis, the thing that just struck me was there's also a refrain that's repeated throughout the first at least in Genesis 1, that God saw the world as good. And at least for Christians, we take that to be an indication both of God's being and subsequently of humanity's being as well. And I was just curious, in your comparative work, if you drew any connections between the kind of two repeated refrains in the two myths.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I actually didn't realize that the phrase "God saw the world as good" was repeated. I just think in general, if something is repeated or emphasized, it's emphasized for a reason. And I think the reason in Genesis at least is God saw the world as good, and from his infinite goodness he created human beings. But it's something that's definite, right? And it's something that draws our appreciation for God, but it's not a question in the sense that it is for the Rgvedic hymn. So I'm not quite sure what the parallel would be. I would have to think about it some more, but thank you.
Professor Reynolds, excuse my ignorance about this stuff, but I found your talk really interesting. But I was a little, was wondering, in the Islamic tradition, the contemporary guy that you quoted, who all I remember is he died in Buffalo in 1979. But it sounded like he was emphasizing, free will, and that salvation is meritorious, right? That is there any kind of tradition or counter tradition of a more predestinarian or and is this something that he says it's on your forehead, right? That so I was wondering what role, if any, this idea of a limited atonement or that salvation is something that everybody can achieve if they follow Sharia, or is it something that's only for those who have that power to do it?
It's an excellent question. Actually, it's a very, very important question, and you spotted precisely tension between the anonymous Muslim with whom the Dominican colleague of Thomas was speaking, and then many years later, this Indian scholar Maududi was saying. Actually, the standard teaching in Sunni Islam is that there is something called divine decree. The Arabic word is qadar, in English letters Qadar. In fact, it's one of so Islam has 5 pillars of practice, and then 6 pillars, which people don't hear about as much, but 6 pillars of faith. And one of those pillars is the divine decree. And there is debate over, well, what does it mean that God has a decree? But the standard idea is that something like determination, predestination. So, and Maududi is from himself, he's from a school that, would accept that. There is Quranic material that goes both ways, but Sunni Islam, at least the form of Sunni Islam that emerged with the majority out of the medieval world, emphasizes divine decree very strongly. I think what's up in this text is that he's speaking in what Christians would call a kind of pastoral context and not a strictly systematic theological context. And inevitably in a pastoral context, I imagine even Calvinists, I don't know, I'm not a Calvinist, but you speak of, you really have a choice to make, I'm inviting you to the straight path.
To Dr. Bealer. Yeah. On my way here, I read an article about this person going to a meditation for 10 days in an isolated room, and the whole point was is part of a standard doctrine and to empty the mind completely. And so when you were talking about that first person, excuse me, I don't catch the names of those three. I know you did three. And the very first one, which was getting rid of the images of the brain, that sounded to me like the goals of Buddhist meditation. And so is that still part of Christian practice anywhere, or do you see those connections?
I mean, so Evagrius of Pontus was the man's name. He founded this tradition. I mean, the ideal. I mean, I mostly used Elizabeth Clark's work for this, and she says the formless mind is the goal, because God Himself is formless. So to become like God, to become deified, divinized, the idea is to become as formless as He is. And I would say, that there's definitely a parallel there to the Buddhist kind of emptying of the mind. But like when you look at people like Hans-Urs von Balthasar, Catholic theologians, they have criticized this as too Eastern, as it were, for Christianity, But it's interesting to see that even within Christianity, you have that heritage and this tradition, that then people like Dionysius and then Maximus have then, as it were, reintegrated into the ecclesial context. Because what can happen when you go formless, let's say, is you don't need any institutions anymore. You don't need any forms anymore. You don't need any liturgy. You don't need any sacraments. So there's a kind of anarchistic tendency there, right? And when the sacraments are, as it were, the heart of the life of the religion, you see how that, has to be at least integrated into, participation in the liturgy, hierarchy, and so on. So.
I wanted to ask Professor Reynolds. I had the real privilege of living for 2 years in Morocco, and it was anything but a simple experience. It is a beautiful country. The whole thing is very complicated, but one thing that struck me was that Moroccans, and most of the ones I knew were very faithful Muslims, very strong believers. They wouldn't be likely to tell you, well, it doesn't matter what religion or Christianity is just as good. They wouldn't say that. But basically, they're very tolerant people, very tolerant and hospitable. And one thing I wanted to get your opinion on was, why is it that the more intolerant or strict branches of Islam are so intolerant towards their own Muslims, for instance, the Sufis? What is it? What do they have against them? They sometimes blow up their mosques, so.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for highlighting the beautiful aspects of that Muslim majority country, hospitality. It really is, I think, woven into the fabric of most Islamic cultures. You can't really, I guess, completely generalize, but in many different Muslim majority countries I've been to, like, hospitality is really key. I don't know, my wife is from Lebanon, and sometimes she says, well, it's a kind of virtue signaling because you've got to show to your neighbors how hospitable you are. It's not only that. She's right about most things, but not about that one. So yeah, but there is a sort of awkward marriage of certain virtues with certain dispositions which are seen as signs of a pious Muslim. Well, maybe it's not even an awkward marriage because both things are seen as signs of a pious Muslim. Actually, Father Aquinas might comment on this. He knows Egypt very well. So, hospitality, friendship are seen as signs of pious Muslims. Patience, gentle, kind disposition, all things that we can learn from. But another thing that's seen as a sign of pious Muslim is awareness of being a good Muslim, even if that involves knowing where you draw the line. So in terms of maybe your daughter's behavior, or in terms of the absolute scandal it would be if one member of your family converted to Christianity. I mean, you could become an atheist, deny God entirely, but God forbid you become a Christian. In fact, in some cases, your life could be at risk. So these are all different ways that are sort of lifted up by popular preachers, but also when you're hanging out with your friends, drinking coffee, I would never tolerate that because I'm a good Muslim. So, it's very complicated, and as you may know, Sufis have been the target, particularly of Sunni Muslims who are more along the line of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in that sort of orientation, so more conservative Sunni groups. They're seen as representing what is an offense to Islam, which is innovating the religion, adding new stuff to it, music and dance and all these things that people in the West think is really cool. Many sort of conservative Sunni Muslims would see as innovations.
What is the Arabic word for innovation?
It's bid'ah, B-I-D-A.
I forgot that.
Yeah.
Thanks. This is a really exciting panel. So I think I have some crude ideas about how other world religions look at the term Catholic imagination. And I think Muslims, being sort of iconoclastic, would look at the Catholic imagination as, well, that's representational art. We don't do that. So they have this rich, decorative, amazing decorative tradition. I think I understand that the Orthodox have a very strong apophatic sort of streak in hesychasm, but that they also have an unbelievably rich, iconic tradition, which is representational, not in the same way that Renaissance art is, but I don't know anything really about the Hindu or Vedic traditions. I mean, do these religious traditions have do they characterize Catholic imagination in a particular way? And if they do, what is that way? Can you help me understand what that could be to explore?
Yeah, well, very interesting question. The thing is, to my understanding, Hindus, at least at the time, who were composing hymns like the Rgvedic, the Bhagavad Gita, all these things, they didn't know Christians. Or at least there aren't direct encounters until much later on, the 15th century, which is when the Dominicans entered India, and the Jesuit encounters the Hindus in the 17th century. So it's a much more contemporary sort of exchange of ideas. So I can't really say what the author of the Rgvedic may have thought of the Catholic imagination. In the hymn, it seems you're drawing on all of these analogies and painting a picture of things that may be or may not be, and it is very imaginative. It like evokes a lot of imagery, but not in a way that they would, not in the way that we think of it, I guess. Like, it kind of reminds me of the first question of, like, in Genesis, God saw the world as good. But in Hinduism, like, depending on what part of Hinduism, it doesn't seem like you would know what God saw the world as. Like, God was thought to, like, for some people just kind of be this, like, ambiguous, impersonal God that you couldn't really attribute human features to. So in that sense, like, it's just kind of hard to answer the question, like, how God might have seen the world.
Well, I'll take this opportunity to ask a question for Dr. Beeler, just very briefly, because I think we only have a few minutes left. But I apologize if I missed the distinction, but I was wondering if you could touch upon, is like any distinction between the imagery and imaging of the sacraments and other types of images like the ecclesial hierarchy in the Eastern thought that you were going over?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting principles of studying the fathers is that, they have always analogical definitions of things, right? So when they say image, it's not bam, one definition and that's it. But they will find what image means on many different levels of reality, right? So the icon is an image as well, but it is a special kind of image, right? So you add the sacramental layers to an image, it becomes the icon, it becomes the sacrament, has also that embedded in it, because as the closer you get, as it were, to the heart of reality, right, to the heart of the cosmos, as Christ has been called by like Rowan Williams and others, everything that's included in creation is there, right? So image as well, and in a way, it's most revealed what an image is in the first place when you look at Christ. And so I think that's the sense that these fathers have, like Dionysius and Maximus. And the church as a hierarchy, I mean, also is a kind of image, right? It's the image of the celestial hierarchy, of the order of the angels, right? It corresponds for Dionysius to the order of the orders of the church. So again, you can look, in a way, you can look at everything as a kind of image. Yeah. That's the answer, I guess.
Thanks. I think we have time for maybe one more quick. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Ms. Govil, I wanted to, forgive me if I murdered your name, didn't mean to. I was listening, I teach world religions and know nothing really of Hinduism, but this is where I find my teaching duties calling me. And I was looking again at the Rigveda, their text, which I've taught, and with that refrain, there's refrains, it's poetry, obviously, and it's who is, and that other text from elsewhere in the Rigveda that finished off with, I paraphrase, the Most High knows. Could this be something, I know there's a sacrificial substrate there from what I've read, right, in the Rigveda, in the cult. Could it have a dimension, maybe even later, that it was used or redacted in a kind of meditative key for the people praying these refrains to be just left in darkness where God could be present? And I'm using Neoplatonic terminology here, but to kind of like leave the people praying it just in unknowing darkness and leave the next step to the one.
That's a really interesting question. Well, I think, so for Hindus, so it would, again, it depends on like the sect of Hinduism, but people would have these stories like passed down to them by their families or in the tradition. And many, like, because of the caste system, I would say, like, the Brahmin class, like the high caste, it was like their role to be priests in society and to like really meditate on these texts in a way that was deeper than the other sects of society. But the majority of Hindus, I don't know if I should say that, but would not meditate on the text for its philosophical reasons or philosophical purposes. Like there's schools in India where boys who are 5 or 6 year olds spend like 20 hours a day learning how to recite like the Rigveda and the other Vedas by memory. And these boys don't know Sanskrit. They're literally just memorizing the verses, because in Hinduism, it's less so the meaning of the text, which is why I say it's a bit anti-philosophical. It's more so the sounds that you make when you're reciting the text in Sanskrit that connect you to the divine in some way. So yeah, I don't think like the lay Hindu would think of or reflect on these texts in a yogic sense. But it is an interesting idea that maybe you are meant to be enveloped in darkness to like as an incentive to sort of pray and find answers in prayer. But I think that would have been like, yeah, a much later like bhakti devotion, which focused on like Krishna and Radha as like attributing actual like personal attributes to God. But yeah, historically, I don't really see that.
Thank you, and please join me in thanking our panel for these great talks.